So, this week we're looking at the story of Abigail, which you can find in 1 Samuel chapter 25. I love Abigail's story because it speaks so powerfully to those of us who found ourselves dealing with difficult people or situations that can seem totally beyond our control. Abigail's story is one of finding wisdom, purpose, and ultimately redemption, even in the midst of very challenging circumstances. And the context of this story is that David, although he's been anointed king, is actually hiding out in the wilderness from King Saul. And while he's doing that, he's been protecting Nabal's flock. Now, those flocks are sizable. That's 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. So by any measure, Nabal is very rich. Now, the Bible also tells us that Abigail, his wife, was discerning and beautiful, but that Nabal was harsh and badly behaved. Now, David sends his young men to Nabal's house on a feast day and reminds him how they've cared for his flock and asks Nabal to treat his young men with favour, fully expecting him to welcome them as honoured guests because Nabal has actually profited from the protection of David's men. But instead of welcoming these young men, Nabal basically asks, "Who is this David?" Perhaps Nabal is looking at the natural. Perhaps he's only seeing a comparison between himself as the rich guy and David as a lowly, rough shepherd who's living in the wilderness, effectively a fugitive. But this isn't anybody that Nabal is dissing and dismissing. It's the future king. And he doesn't seem to realize or consider who this guy is going to become or who David is. And his arrogant and thoughtless reply to God's anointed king seals his fate. Major mistake. Now, Nabal failed to acknowledge even the fact that David and his men have protected his flock from raiders. There was no requirement for them to do so, and he's refusing to participate in the deeply embedded culture of hospitality, where it's common for the wealthy to provide food and hospitality. And actually refusing to provide that hospitality, especially to David's men on a feast day, was a massive breach of social norms and etiquette. It almost is that he feels that people owe him something. And we almost get a sense here that the rules don't seem to apply to him. His refusal to offer the customary hospitality is incredibly disrespectful and is a real slap in the face to David. Just a bit of an aside from the story at the moment. I know someone who went up to London to actually an event where our past British Prime Minister John Major was speaking. And what they noticed was that this former Prime Minister was surrounded by his own cronies, who were probably telling him how great he was. And so he ended up being kind of stuck in this feedback loop of everybody telling him how great he is. And I do wonder somehow if this is what had happened with Nabal. All these people are around him, the hangers on because of his riches, and telling him how fantastic he is. And perhaps he got puffed up, began to believe that he was somebody special, when of course he was just an ordinary man who God had blessed. This whole thing is also a matter of honour. What Nabal does here is so disrespectful, so dishonouring, it cannot go unnoticed or unavenged. So David tells his 400 men to strap on their swords. We're going to avenge this insult. And it's not hard to understand David's rage and anger, because when someone insults us, especially when we've been nothing but kind to them, our first instinct can be to lash out. Perhaps you can think of someone that's spoken unkindly to you, even when you've been on their side, and perhaps you can remember how that felt. And David, even though he's been anointed by God, was still a man with very human emotions, and he is angry, and he's out for revenge. And as all this is kicking off, one of Nabal's servants goes to Abigail and tells her what's been going on. He knows how offensive his master has been, and he's confident that David is not going to take this lying down. In fact, David's words are, "Surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good." Now, until this point in the story, we've not really heard anything of Abigail, Nabal's wife. She's not been remarkable, but this young man, her husband's servant, somehow knows that she's the one to go to. He knows she's wise and calm. Perhaps his master's a bit of a hothead, and he goes to Abigail. And this is Abigail's moment. It's a little reminiscent of Esther's story, where we're told she came to the palace for such a time as this. Maybe behind the scenes, Abigail had long been quietly using her wisdom to manage her household, been pursuing God, handling the weight of living with such a foolish man. We can't see all those moments in this biblical account, but when you look at her story, you kind of sense that they must have been there. All those quiet things that no one sees, the things she did in the quiet of her own heart, in the quiet of her own home, they weren't wasted. And in this moment, they become deeply relevant. This is a turning point moment for Abigail. And I believe there are times in our lives, turning point moments, if you like, where we're given an opportunity, a choice. And at those points, that's when God can change the course and direction of our lives. After hearing from the messenger, Abigail doesn't waste any time. She responds really quickly. She knows that she's got to stave off David's righteous anger. So she commands her servants to bake bread, take wine, grain, figs, and raisins, jumps on a donkey and goes to meet David, knowing he's on his way with his men to kill her husband Nabal. This shows incredible courage because, of course, it was common to destroy entire families. So her own life is on the line here. And she doesn't head out with just a few supplies. She heads out with 200 loaves, hundreds of cakes of figs and raisins. Now, her response seems really generous, but she knows that David had asked for provision, that he was due it, and that she had to act generously to stave off disaster. And it's interesting that she says to her servants, "Take all these things," but she tells them, "Don't tell my husband." This is a bit controversial, I think, but sometimes if you've got someone in your life who doesn't have wisdom, certainly doesn't have godly wisdom, or just doesn't have common sense even, but has the power to say no, sometimes you just need to do the thing you feel led by God to do, then ask for permission or forgiveness afterwards. And that's exactly what Abigail does here. I think this is an important point for those of us who've found ourselves in situations where we know what needs to be done, but those with authority over us lack the wisdom to make the right decision. And I'm not suggesting we should be deceitful or undermine legitimate authority, but there are times when we must act with wisdom, even when those around us cannot see it. And sometimes doing a thing and asking for permission afterwards might actually be the right course of action. Now, with such a rich husband, it seems likely that Abigail probably had access to some pretty nice horses, but she chooses to meet David riding on a donkey. It's such a posture of humility. She's giving a clear message. I'm not even worthy to be your equal. She's showing she comes in peace. And of course, we know that Jesus himself rode into Jerusalem on a donkey because he was showing that he came in peace. When Abigail saw David, she jumped off her donkey, fell face down, bowing low before him, and her words are so humble, such a contrast to those of her husband. "On me alone, Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand," she says. She accepts blame for the foolishness of her husband, and she reminds David that God is the one who avenges, that it's not for man to avenge himself. And she seems to know something about what God has promised David, as we can see from her words. When the Lord has done all he promised and has made you leader of Israel, don't let this be a blemish on your record. And in this encounter with David, Abigail does two key things. First, she fully accepts blame for her husband's actions and his foolishness. And then she shows incredible wisdom by suggesting to David that the last thing he should do is become king with her husband's blood on his hands. David's reputation seems to have gone before him because she reminds him who he is. She says, "My Lord fights the battles of the Lord." And also who his God is, using the clever analogy of a sling, saying, "And the lives of your enemies, he, the Lord your God, shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling," alluding to his defeat of Goliath. Her words show incredible wisdom. She doesn't plead with David for her own life or that of her husband. She shows David why it would be bad for him to take revenge against her husband. And she focuses on the effect on him as a future leader and as a man of God. That's true wisdom. So often we argue from the point of view of how things will affect us, and yet this is not what she does at all. She spoke an incredibly hard truth to David, but she couches it in wise and gentle words. It's hard to imagine the courage this must have taken. Abigail went out to face David and his 400 men, bloodthirsty and seeking revenge. She certainly was no ordinary woman. Yet David acts in an extraordinary way too. He shows great humility as he acknowledges not only to Abigail, but in front of his 400 fighting men, waiting for revenge, listening to the exchange, and he responds to her saying, "You have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand." And his immediate impulse then is to thank God as he realizes that God, through Abigail, has stopped him from murder, and he encourages Abigail to return home, promising her that he will not kill her husband. I think this shows us something of why David is called a man after God's own heart. We can see he's so passionate and headstrong, but also combine that with the humility to acknowledge when he's in the wrong. I mean, just imagine the scene. David's just said, "Come on, guys, strap on your swords. We're going in for a fight." And their bloodlust must have been up. And now David has to backtrack to acknowledge that he was about to make a huge mistake. And he does this all in front of his men. That took courage as well as incredible humility and wisdom. I don't know about you, but the older I get, the harder it is to receive correction, to acknowledge that I've made a mistake or I'm on the wrong path. You'd have thought it ought to get easier, but it doesn't seem to, does it? I think sometimes we can feel embarrassed when someone points out we're acting in an ungodly way or not in a consistent way with who they know us to be or who God calls us to be. Certainly as we're older, it feels like really awful that we've been caught out or that we've missed the mark somehow. But don't you think that those people who are prepared to speak out and to correct us in that way, sometimes those are the best of friends to us, those ones who speak the truth with love? I'm not so sure that I would be able to speak the words that David spoke to Abigail that day when he says, "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me." David could have wrecked his future with one rash act. Yet he's ready to realize his mistake, to see God's hand, even in the actions of this woman who he doesn't know and whose husband has deeply offended him. Now, David seemed to intuitively know something of this truth that we find in James 4:10, where it says, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you." May we be like David, passionate for God, yet willing to accept correction and to receive rebuke. May we be willing to see God's plan and purpose behind those who bring such words to us. And may we be ready to respond quickly and humbly to such words. Now, David had faced real hardship after he was anointed king. Almost everything had gone wrong. King Saul chased him down, seeking to destroy him, and he was forced to hide out in the desert. Yet even here, God is shaping him and molding him into the kind of man who will make a great king. When Abigail returns home, she finds her husband Nabal having a wild and drunken party. So wisely, she says nothing. It's not till the morning that she chooses to tell him what's happened. At which point, he has a stroke, is paralyzed, and dies a few days later. And so Nabal pays the ultimate price for treating God's anointed servant, David, so badly. And when David hears what's happened to Nabal, he expresses his thanks to God, realizing that God has avenged him, saying, "Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal and has kept his servant from evil." What was that evil? It wasn't just the blood guilt. It was also from working salvation with his own hand. Now, soon afterwards, David sends to Abigail, asking her to be his wife, and so she becomes part of his household. And of course, although David clearly respected and admired her, the marriage offered him practical benefits as well, control over Nabal's estate, including those very sheep and goats, the 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats that he'd been protecting in the desert. So his offer of marriage to Abigail also solves his food supply problem. Now, in our Western society, we're so used to seeing romance as a vital precursor to marriage, but of course in Middle Eastern society, things were different. Women often married for protection and financial security. And I think that Abigail's story reflects that, but it also goes beyond it because she wasn't just a convenient solution for David. It was because of her wisdom, her gentle nature, and her humility, and I think also her courage, that everything turned out well for her in the end. She has such a wise and beautiful spirit. I think she's a real living example of what we read in 1 Peter 3, verses 3 to 4, where it says, "Let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." Abigail's story shows us something powerful because she's walking faithfully in the wisdom and gifting God has given her. And because she's doing that, he opens the door to her next step. He takes her out of that difficult situation. I think it's a clear reminder that when we use what he's already placed in our hands, he will lead us forward. It's a bit like that parable of the talents, where you either use what God's given you or you risk losing it. I wonder if it's the same when God gifts us with something. If we don't use it, do we actually have any right to moan about God not doing something in our lives? I don't know the answer. That's a question that I ask myself. I think often it's only when we step out and use what he's already given us that he then reveals the next step. And I think in Luke 16:10 it says, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much." And I think we need to show ourselves as trustworthy. I don't think we can sit back and refuse to use our gift and then expect God to move. I think it's sometimes only in the moving, that as we move, as we follow and we step forward, that he opens the very doors we've been asking him to open. In this story, I think there's some really key takeaways for us today. Abigail was faced with a really difficult person in her life. In her case, it was her husband, but for us, that person could be a friend, a colleague, an adult child, or even a parent. But what's important is how Abigail chose to respond. She could easily have said, "Why me?" or given into the belief that life was unfair and just hard. But instead, she pressed deeper into God. She sought him more, pursued his wisdom more, and she became known as a wise and humble woman. And that's what ultimately allowed her to redeem Nabal's mistake and prevent bloodshed, because she chose to lead herself. I'm going to say that again because I think it's so important. She chose to lead herself. She didn't wait for someone else to lead her, to guide her, to show her the way. She had the courage of her convictions and stepped forward. She sought God herself. She listened for his voice and she moved when he spoke. I think that as women, especially if we're on our own, whether we're single, divorced, or widowed, however we got here, it's so important that we choose to lead ourselves. We can't keep blaming our lack of direction on the church or the busyness of life or the fact that we're alone, because at the end of the day, like Abigail, we are ultimately responsible for our own spiritual leadership. It's that simple. And as we think about her story, there must have been times when for her to submit to her husband went against everything in her. She must have known he was wrong, that his decision lacked wisdom or was outright foolish. It must have been incredibly hard to submit to him. But as we discussed in a previous episode, true submission only exists when you actually disagree. You can only submit when you don't agree. So actually, it's a godly principle that, when you don't agree with someone and yet they're your godly leader or your spiritual leader or whatever, actually, you can only submit when you disagree. And I believe, as we see in Abigail's story, God honors that kind of submission when he calls us to it. So perhaps in a work situation, you've got a boss who makes poor decisions. So if you've put your 2 penny worth in and they still go ahead and make their stupid decision, you don't need to keep fighting. You can just sit back and be at peace because you've done what God's asked of you. Your conscience is clear. You can decide not to be anxious about the outcome because it's not your problem. You've given it back to God. Now let it rest. And we can trust that if we've honored God and done what's right, he will either bring about the right result or use the situation for good. These are not easy lessons, are they? I think one of the other things that this story reminds us is that it's not up to man to avenge himself, that God is the one who avenges us, and it's the same for us today. In Deuteronomy 32:35, it says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." And Abigail knew that God was the one to avenge because she'd lived with her foolish husband for so many years, and she'd likely suffered deeply in her mind. But now she's vindicated. And God's judgment on Nabal, it served as some form of divine justice, not just for David, but also for his wife Abigail. Because Abigail goes from being the wife of Nabal, a harsh and foolish man, to being the wife of David, God's anointed king. He's a strong warrior with the heart of a shepherd's boy. I think it's natural for us to want revenge, especially when either ourselves or someone we love has been treated badly. I know in my own life there have been times when I've wanted to take action into my own hands, where my mind's gone down that rabbit hole of feeling how good it would feel to take revenge. There's something curiously satisfying about those kind of thoughts, isn't there? But I think it's what we choose to do with those thoughts that actually determines who we will become. Will we have the patience and the faith to leave those people who wound us, who hurt us with their words or their actions, in God's hands and allow Him to avenge us instead? When we're filled with anger or even rage, will we, like David did, will we acknowledge that we're perhaps sometimes even in the wrong? Will we persist in pursuing that path because to turn back now would be to lose face? The enemy was trying to trip David up, just like he tries to trip us up today. David later wrote Psalm 37, where he's laughing at his enemies, knowing that God will avenge him. Here's what he says in verses 12 to 13. "The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming." I can't help but wonder if he was thinking of this encounter with Nabal when he penned those words. And in Psalm 18, verse 47, David again reflects on how God has fought for him and given him victory as he writes, "The God who gave me vengeance and subdued peoples under me." He acknowledges that it's not his own strength that brings victory. It's God who brings justice, God who vindicates. Maybe you're facing your own Nabal right now, a difficult person or a situation that feels out of your control. If that's you, hear this. God sees you. He sees your endurance. He sees your faith. And just as he did with Abigail, God can take your faithfulness, your quiet courage, even in the hardest of places, and use them to change the outcome, to open new doors, to lead you into a new future filled with purpose and hope. So keep trusting, keep seeking God's wisdom, keep leading yourself with courage and grace, and trust that in His perfect timing and His perfect justice, God will vindicate you. He will fight for you, and He will make all things right. I hope Abigail's story has encouraged you in some way today. If it has, I'd love for you to share it with a friend you think might find it encouraging too. And if you haven't already, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review if you found it helpful. If you've ever felt unseen or long to know that your story matters, I'd love to invite you to explore more in my book, Invisible Women of the Bible. Each chapter is just 2 pages long. It's designed for even the busiest of days, something just to read quickly over your morning coffee. It's in the final stages of the editing, so by the time you listen to this, maybe it's already live on Amazon. And this book explores the often untold stories of women of the Bible and explores how they found hope, healing, and purpose in the middle of their difficult seasons. Until next time, remember, your faithfulness in the unseen moments matters. God sees you. He sees what others may miss. And until then, remember, however things look right now, God isn't finished with your story yet.